A footnote to freedom. When I first began this project of writing the account of my grandfather, I really wanted his story to be an inspiring tale of courage and remarkable achievements against all the odds. A real underdog story is what I imagined. A character who immediately would be a poster child for the generation of his time. What I discovered, however, was a very different story to write. The character who emerged turned out not to be a hero at all, really. Yes, there were some remarkable things my grandfather accomplished, in circumstances that were tremendously challenging for anyone to face. In the end, however, what my grandfather offered is a very human story, marked by startling paradoxes of hope and heartache, determination and despair, love and loneliness, and perhaps the most salient paradox that all humans face, fear and freedom. To speak as freely as possible regarding my father's views on the events and characters within my grandfather's story, I decided that I would change the names of many in order to respect the privacy of their descendants. To put it in another way, the opinions shared in these pages are those of me and my father, and aren't intended to portray in full and accurate detail the characters and circumstances of other individuals. In fact, I hope this account encourages others to share their story as they remember it, or as it has been passed down to them. As one who grew up in a community shaped by the constant retelling of biblical stories, I have come to appreciate that the truth of what it means to be human rests in between our varied and collective experiences. This is why creating spaces for diverse students in our society is so crucial in discovering the very best of who we can be as a human race. My grandfather, despite all his shortcomings, still played a role in one of the most remarkable tales of courage and determination in Canadian history. As the great Canadian storyteller Leonard Cohen once remarked, "There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." It is my hope in this betrayal of this broken but beloved human being, you will see where the redemptive light shines within your own story as well.
The bugle called, and forth we went, to serve the crown, our backs far bent, and build whate'er that must be done, but ne'er to fire an angry gun. No heroes we, no, nay, not one. With deep lament we did our job, despite the shame, our manhood robbed. We built and fixed again, to prove our worth as proud black men, and hasten sure the Kaiser's end. From Scotia Port to Seaport Square, across to France, the conflict there, at Villajou and Place Perron, for God and King to right the wrong. The number 2, 600 strong. Stripped to the waist and sweated chest, midday's reprieve, much needed rest. We dug and hauled and lifted high, from trenches deep towards the sky. Non-fighting troops, and yet we die. The peace restored, the battle won. Black sweat and toil had beat the Hun. Black blood was spilled, black bodies maimed, for medals brave, no black was named. Yet proud were we, our pride unshamed. But time will bring forth other wars, then give to us more daring chores, that we might prove our courage strong, preserve the right, repel the wrong, and proud we'll sing the battle song.
Intro. Reckoning with Race. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. James Baldwin. Well, at least there's one moment I can look forward to in this purgatory of a daily commute. As the Deerfoot Trail Expressway winds through the heart of Calgary, it takes a wide curve west onto the Caffaro Bridge, which crosses the swift currents of the Bow River. And at instant, the majestic range of the Rocky Mountains appears straight ahead on the horizon, their snow-capped peaks piercing the sun setting behind them. Each day I gratefully breathe in this brief display of creation's glory, just as the road quickly turns south again through the urban sprawl of the city. On this particular day, though, my ritual moment of gratitude was interrupted by the phone ringing through the car speaker. I pressed the talk button. "Hello, it's Lance here." "Son," the voice rang through the speaker. "It's your father. I wanted you to know the apology. It's happening." My father's words immediately pulled my attention away from the horizon before me, and I found myself staring back into a long and dark history. "Is this for real?" I asked. "How do you know this?" "I got a call from Carol, who helps run the Black History Museum of Saskatchewan. She just got off the phone with a senior officer in the military. The date is already set, July 9th of next summer. It will mark the time they formed the battalion." My dad's voice fell quiet. "Now that it's finally happening," I asked him, "how do you feel?" Another moment of silence passed, and then he slowly replied, "Truth be told, I never believed it would happen in my lifetime. And now that it has come, it just doesn't seem right that I would be the one to hear it. And really, of all of his sons, I'm sure I would have been the last one my father would have chosen to stand before the Prime Minister of Canada on his behalf. But that's another story." From an early age, our siblings and I had learned about our papa, George Dixon, being one of 600 men who served in the first and only Black Battalion in Canadian history. Sadly, much of my knowledge of the story had stopped there. No doubt it was very difficult for my father or any in his generation to tell the story without reliving the painful racism they endured and the shame they were taught to feel about being black bodies in a white man's world, as they were so often told. It's taken a whole generation to find the collective strength to bring to light the painful irony of their struggle, that these men had to fight their own country for the right to fight for the freedom of others in a distant land. In effect, white society refused to see the souls of these men, who, like any other human being, possessed hope and heartache, bravery and brokenness, and simply desired to be treated as human beings like any other. I have to admit, as a young man, I wasn't ready to fully appreciate who these men were either. Growing up as a biracial boy in Detroit during the 70s, in the wake of the race riots that literally burned through that city, I was aware of the violence that plagued a divided America across the color line. Many states still held on to the laws that defined people according to their racial heritage, even though the federal government signed the Civil Rights Act 6 years prior to my birth. It didn't matter that I was a light-skinned kid born of a white mother. Because my father was black, the state defined me as black. And those around me didn't question it, for by then racial identity had become more than simply the color of one's skin. Over the generations, race became as much about the collective culture and consciousness of existing as other than white. And the idea of whiteness in America was exclusive. So exclusive, in fact, that in the early days of constructing racial classes in America, even Europeans who were not of Anglo-Saxon descent were considered non-whites. For instance, as the Irish showed up on the shores of America in the wake of the famine that impoverished their land, which, by the way, many historians argue was the result of relentless colonial exploitation of their agriculture by the English. They were deemed by the British upper class as, quote, the European Negroes. Initially, they were pushed into the same ghettos as the blacks and Jews on the lower streets of New England cities. But in a short time, however, a vast number of Europeans gave up their distinct language and culture in order to assimilate into the upper class of English-speaking white America. In my current work as a racial equity educator, we try to foster classrooms as places where students can reclaim and celebrate their stories of the past in order to reimagine a future in which they truly belong. Ironically, it is often, quote, the white teachers and students who struggle the most with the exercise, for so many of their ancestors deliberately erased their own sense of history in order to be normalized in a racially segregated society. And make no mistake, those laws of segregation were powerful in shaping society. They predetermined where people grew up, the kind of schools they attended, the places where people worked and shopped. And nowhere was the segregated landscape of America more evident than at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. The phenomena of black churches and Chinese or Spanish congregations, all these betray the painful reality that even our religious denominations were complicit in shaping a racially segregated society. Very few white Americans can imagine church being any different than what it looks like through their own cultural lens. For instance, folk attending white suburban churches may be surprised to hear that inside the front doors of our church in urban Detroit hung a large picture of a black man with an afro hairstyle. Every one of us kids knew that was Jesus greeting us when we walked through the door. And if anyone questioned that, they'd be met with a puzzled glare. How else would Jesus look? My father would tell you that things were going well in Detroit. He was the producer of 2 popular locally syndicated television shows and was surrounded by creative and energetic people. He was also the pastor of a congregation that was consciously engaged in the social struggle of the day. Grace Episcopal Church was situated right across the street from the Blind Pig, the infamous after-hours club that was the first building to be set ablaze in the riots that engulfed the city. Through ministry in the community, Dad was deeply aware of the unresolved racial conflict that still gripped Detroit. And over time, my parents watched the white flight to the suburbs, which sadly included some of their own acquaintances. Along with them, disappeared the economic wealth that could have been valuable assets to rebuilding communities. But instead, public institutions like the school system were decimated. My parents parents couldn't afford private schools, which left us with no choice but to deal with the upheaval happening in education. In the end, my parents thought moving to Canada would avoid all this. It turns out, racism didn't stop at the border. My father found work as a summer camp director for kids outside of London, Ontario. At first, I was shocked by how confused people in London seemed to be about race. The city existed in the heart of what was called Upper Canada during colonial times, whose society was built on the values of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, euphemistically referred to as WASP culture. I was suddenly faced with navigating a society dominated by white people, many of whom seemed to carry a latent prejudice against anything that did not resemble old colonial England. Strangers seemed concerned about knowing, what are you? Where are your parents from? This left me feeling self-conscious of the fact that I looked a little different from their children. It was also common for kids to point out that I talked different. Apparently I slurred my L's and twanged my A's. My parents seemed oblivious to these things. Little did I know. And I didn't know how to talk about it with them. And school, well, that was the last place I thought to discuss my struggles about race and identity. In fact, as a boy, timid and unsure of myself, quote, passing white became my survival tool when I was at school. I'll never forget the day when I witnessed a group of kids surrounding a girl in a coat room during recess. She was a kid of an immigrant African family, and the only visible black girl in our school. The other kids had begun to ridicule her, calling her darky and callously joking that she would taste like chocolate if she didn't look like, well, you get the idea. I, in that moment, retreated in silence. And when I got home, I went to the bathroom and locked the door. I proceeded to take a bar of ivory soap from the bathtub and rub it furiously into my skin. I was determined to remove any last vestiges of dark pigment I had. Alas, after the third day of doing this, rashes started to appear all over my skin. I got so itchy I finally relented and took a bath. I recall sitting there for a long time, staring at the ceiling and soaking in my self-pity. Looking back, I'm filled with sadness that I had so quickly learned to look with shame on my blackness. Why was I so desperate to fit into a society created to exclude people? Perhaps it was enough to have experienced, even marginally, the uncomfortableness of being labeled other and different. Not long after my failed attempt at whitening my skin with ivory soap, our family moved again. A few days after we unpacked our boxes, I took my bike out for a ride. I was about a block down the street when this boy approached me on his bike. "Hey," he shouted as he coasted to a stop. "You new on the block? What's your name?" To this day, I relive the intense anxiety that clenched my throat as I looked into the eyes of this kid staring back at me. To him, the question was quite simple. In me, however, his words touched a deep nerve. Without warning, it surfaced the far more complicated question that was causing something of a crisis in my young mind. My hands held more tightly onto the handlebars as I blankly stared back at him. What are you? That was the real question I heard him ask me. In complete desperation, I blurted out, "Mike. My name is Mike." Of course, the inevitable happened. Later that Saturday morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, mindlessly eating my cereal, when someone knocked on our front door. I heard my mom get up from her chair in the living room and open it. In the instant I heard the boy's voice, My spoon froze halfway to my mouth. After the boy asked my mom if Mike could come out and play, I heard my mother in a puzzled tone explain that no one by the name of Mike lived here. As the door closed shut, I waited with dread for my mother to appear in the kitchen. She never came. The next day, the kid caught up to me at the end of the street. "So, what's up? Do you live in that house or not?" I shrugged, then nodded. With the same puzzled look with which I'm sure my mom had looked at him, he continued, "But the lady said you didn't live there." And again the boy stared at me. Finally, I muttered, "Oh, you mean my mom. Well, my name is Lance, but I prefer Mike, like a nickname." It didn't change the bewildered look on the boy's face. Eventually, as if the summer day was too good to waste on nonsensical conversation, he shrugged his shoulders and jumped back on his bike. As I began pedaling off behind him, this overwhelming feeling of stupidity came over me. Really? Mike? What was I thinking? Truth is, how could I expect him to understand that I just wanted to be normal? After all, no one in the world except me was named Lance. It only reminded me of being different. I mean, who names their child Lance, anyway? Parents who were different, that's who. At least with a name like Mike, I'd hoped there'd be one less thing that was different about me. After all, to be different meant to be surrounded in the back of a coat room, of being ridiculed and rejected. No thanks. I was happy to pretend to be someone else. When I was with my father in strange places, though, I couldn't avoid it. I'll never forget one particular time that happened on the Muncie, Delaware Nation Reserve, about a 40-minute drive west of the city. My father, being the only colored man in his religious denomination, was often sent there to provide religious services to the, quote, Indians, as his bishop called them. One day he decided to take me along. I recall driving up the long country road until at last we reached the high wooded gate entrance into the reserve. Among sparsely scattered buildings there was a church that also functioned as a community center. After the service, I wandered down the hallway to where it opened up into a gym. There happened to be a bunch of boys of various ages playing a game of pickup floor hockey. I stood in the doorway for a few minutes watching them. I could see a few of them looking over at me, and feeling a little self-conscious just standing there by myself, I picked up a stick and started idly slapping a ball against the side of the wall. Eventually, a couple of the older boys walked toward me. "What are you doing here?" one curiously asked. Not sure how to respond, I shrugged and said, "I don't know. I came with my dad." "Who's your dad?" he pressed further. Assuming the kid hadn't sat through the church service, I wasn't sure how to explain it to him. As it turned out, I didn't need to come up with an answer because in that moment my dad walked into the gym. "Oh, there you are, son," he called out. "I'm almost done. Meet me at the car in 5 minutes, will you?" My dad glanced over at the boys standing next to me and gave a wave and disappeared. The boy turned to me. "Is that your dad?" "Yeah," I faintly replied. "That's my dad." And then his look changed in a way that I had seen so often in others. "Oh, so you and Nick, then?" And of course, I responded as I usually did in the many uncomfortable moments of being othered. I laughed it off. It felt so weak, so disingenuous to smile and pretend it didn't matter to me, that people needed to point out I was not like them. Especially here, I thought, in a community literally shaped by centuries of racial prejudice and exploitation, people could still not imagine our relationships apart from the social otherness. On the ride home to the city, I sat in the back with a dejected feeling. It would be nice to show up somewhere in the world and not have to explain myself, to simply exist in spaces without having to justify why I am there. The next day, I woke up and went to school. As I walked into the crowded hallways of students and headed to my first class, I tried to put what happened the day before into the back of my mind. After all, looking around my classroom, who in this place would even relate to what I experienced? I doubted any of them, including the teacher, had been to the Muncie Nation. If they even knew it existed. Just forget about it, I said to myself, and move on. That was the best advice I could give myself at the time. But school, however, kept reminding me that race was an unavoidable aspect of our identity in this society. For instance, years later, I was sitting in a grade 12 English class among some 30 other students. The teacher, an older white man with gray hair, greased back, had a habit of picking random students to read characters as they popped up in our novel studies. I'll never forget the moment while reading The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, when Huck and Tom came across a slave named Jim. Teacher turned to me and said, "Lance, I understand your father is black. Read the part of Jim." Now, I had paid enough attention to know that the setting of the book was an old southern town in Missouri. What could a kid from an urban city in the industrial north know about life there? But this teacher was now glaring over at me, and I looked around to see 30 kids shooting curious glances in my direction. So I tried to speak the lines like a southerner from the 1800s. Well, not 2 sentences into the paragraph, the teacher cuts me off. "Well, seems I was mistaken. You have no idea how a black person talks." And abruptly pointed to another student for him to continue. Well, for the rest of the class, I mostly just looked down at my desk, first working through my embarrassment, and then confusion as to how this teacher thinks a black person ought to talk, and then anger that a white man with greased back hair even gets to decide. Needless to say, I didn't put much effort into his course after that. Well, as you can imagine, I had no thought of becoming a teacher when I was in school, but life has a way of coming full circle, and here I now am, determined to foster classrooms in which every student can explore their authentic sense of identity in a positive light. I was recently invited to speak during high school student leadership conference here in Calgary on the topic of creating welcoming schools. All the schools represented were from publicly funded Catholic schools from across the city, so at one point I opened the Bible and read these words. "In Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus." These words, I reminded the participants, were written just a few years after Jesus' death by one of his followers named Paul, in his letter to a fledgling church in Galatia, in the heart of the Roman Empire. As this struggling church was still figuring out how to follow Jesus' message of love, Paul wrote these words as a vision for what the community could become. For even back then, people were divided along these very lines. The truth is, I pointed out, social division is nothing new to the human race. And for the past 2,000 years, we have witnessed the tragedy of our failure to free ourselves from our inherent prejudice of those who are different. At the end of the day, we need to learn how to appreciate our shared humanity. Part of my own healing journey meant to learn to embrace the truth of who my ancestors really were, as human beings in their own right. I wanted to share their joys, hear their heartaches, listen to their dreams, and be challenged by their struggles. I wanted their stories to be told, not simply ignored. Especially in modern times, history books have been written by the privileged. Too often those on the periphery are represented as objects of pity among the powerful, who controlled their destiny, rather than remarkable people who, in the face of their own circumstances, demonstrated deeds of courage and determination that also shaped history. At this moment, I wasn't completely sure how my grandfather's story played out. Despite him being among the few hundred men who formed that historic battalion, I suspect there were struggles and hardships that he may not have fully overcome. But that didn't matter to me now. I think becoming a father was probably the moment when I realized the importance of embracing my identity. I was no longer going to be ashamed of who came before me, and I was determined not to have my children feel any different. I wanted them to walk with pride in this world, to know that who they are is a question they do not need to be ashamed of answering. I pulled into the driveway and stopped the car. "Dad," I said, "I'm going to call you tomorrow. And when I do, I want you to tell me the whole story."